Welcome to the Brush Your Way to a Wicked Good Finish. This afternoon, we're going to talk about an easy to apply finish that, as I say, lasts a lifetime. And what we're talking about is alkyd varnish, oil-based true varnish. The alkyd part is they take an oil, in this case, it's tung oil, and basically disassemble it, add elastomers and dryers, put it back together, and it turns into a wonderful finish. Now, in my shop, I use three finishes. I use alkyd varnish, and I use lacquer, true nitrocellulose, often referred to as acrylic lacquer now, and I use shellac. And those are the finishes that I use. And the reason being, they're all solvent-based finishes. And the reason being is because they're easy to repair and easy to replace when the time comes. And that's really, really important. When I first got into this whole business, I was doing furniture restoration. I had worked in a lumber yard when I was in high school and my first couple of years in college. And in that lumber yard, for a couple of years, I ran the paint department. And I became very familiar with finishes and paint strippers and paints and different things. And polyurethane was getting to be the big deal. Valspar came out with polyurethane probably in about, I'm guessing, 1967, 68, long time ago, way in the last millennium. And they were really excited about it, and I became excited about it. And I used it on stuff that I was doing for my parents around their house. And then after I got out of college, I started restoring some furniture and ended up making a career out of restoration that led into woodworking, etc. But the one thing that I just hated the sight of is getting a piece of furniture in that somebody had refinished and used polyurethane on. And maybe it was 7 or 8 years earlier that they had done it and they hadn't done a good job and the polyurethane was failing. And it was absolutely miserable to remove. It was largely unrepairable unless it was a real small blemish. And I really got to dislike any of the plastic finishes. And people ask me, well, what's the ultimate finish for furniture? I said, something that you can repair and replace. That's the ultimate, because there are times where you will have to repair. Either it's damage that you've done while you're getting the piece ready to either put in the house or to deliver to a customer, or somebody damages a piece early on and they bring it back to you and say, I need this repaired. Well, if you use a finish that is not easily repaired, you're kind of up the creek. So the three finishes that I use are very easy to repair. True lacquer can always be dissolved with lacquer thinner, so it's easy to remove, easy to repair, easy to clean up and top coat. All you literally have to do with lacquer to make it look like new is just go over with soap and water, naphtha, and spray a fresh coat on. You don't even have to abrade the surface. It'll bond to itself because it burns in. Shellac's pretty much the same way. Shellac is a very good durable finish. If you put varnish over the top of shellac, it's incredibly durable. And it's easy to repair because it can be dissolved with alcohol. So you can remove it with alcohol. You can repair it by just putting fresh shellac over it. Varnish, very durable finish. It polymerizes as it dries, and it will not dissolve with its own solvent anymore, which is mineral spirits. But it's very easy to remove with something as benign as citrus strip, something like that. So if the finish has totally failed, it's easy to take off. To refresh it, all you need to do is, again, clean it up with soap and water, go over it with some naphtha to get oils. Now you want to scuff sand it with some 400 grit sandpaper to get a sanding scratch in it. You can wipe on or brush on a fresh coat of varnish. Bingo, you're good to go. This stuff lasts. It's durable, and it's beautiful. Varnish has a look to it that you don't get with other finishes. And it's got this, I don't know, it's just vibrant. It's just a beautiful finish. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Waterlocks is the brand that I use. It's easily attainable. You can find it all over the place. You can order it directly from them. I used to use a Pratt & Lambert, product a lot. And a number of years ago, Pratt & Lambert decided they were going to dial back on the production of it. And so it's not as easily found as it used to be, but Waterlocks is everywhere. And Really good stuff. It really is very nice, and nice company to deal with. They're good people there. Now, one of the big things with finishing is to be prepared. One of the biggest problems that I've found over and over is that people dive into finishing without really a good idea of what they're doing, without the proper tools. And the biggest thing is without their piece being prepared, especially when you're using color. It is just absolutely paramount that you have all of your prep work done. And when applying finishes, also, it's a little more forgiving to back up when you're applying a finish, but it's still really frustrating. When you're putting a finish on a piece and you find glue smear or cross grain sanding or dings or dents, it's just not acceptable because you end up stopping, repairing it, and then getting on with finishes. And it just really, it throws you off. Dean says, please provide the steps to get a matte finish with these varnish products. We'll talk about that, Dean. Yes, we will. Matte finishes are a little tough because they show marks very easily, but you can do it. It's not a problem. But the big thing is be prepared. Be prepared to finish. And what I do before I start, even before I start my final sanding, is I vacuum the piece off. Always use a vacuum cleaner. Don't brush it. Don't sweep it. Don't use compressed air. Vacuum it off. You pull up all the particulate matter. You get all the sanding swarf out of there. You clean everything out of the cracks and crevices, and you're ready to go. If you don't do it, it will get picked up in your first initial seal coat. And I can't count the number of times people say, I started finishing something and I was so careful. I even went over to the tack cloth and I started putting finish on, and I don't know where that dust came from. My room wasn't dusty, but I got dust in my finish. Well, they pulled it right up out of the grain of the wood, especially on a ring porous wood like ash or oak, elm, things like that. The sanding dust sits down in those little pores, and of course it just floats right up into your finish, and there you got it. It's an opaque product in your finish, and you really don't want that. I should mention that when I do a grain filled finish where it's piano gloss finish, I use finish for the grain filler. I don't use commercial grain fillers because they are somewhat opaque and they will give your surface a very two-dimensional look. It will get rid of a lot of the chatoyance on that wood surface, and we want to get all that chatoyance. That's where we want really nice clear finishes. And I use gloss for all of my coats up to the final coat. And Dean, this is where you talk about getting a matte finish. I will use gloss for my sealer. I'll use gloss for all my build coats, sanding in between coats to fill all the pores. The reason I use gloss is it's more clear than satin or matte because those have sterrates in them to help keep the surface slightly rough, microscopically rough, and we perceive that diffusing light as satin or matte. So the more matte it is, the more rough, microscopically rough that surface is. So what you want to do is build all your coats with gloss, and then your final coat becomes the surface. In other words, you use a matte finish, matte varnish for your very final coat. And that's all you need. That's what you see anyway. And it's going to give you a very clear finish. If you use dull or matte finish all the way through, it tends to occlude the finish a little bit because there's a lot of flattener in there that is going to disrupt that finish. So start out with gloss and work to matte or whatever. Okay, this is your basic finishing kit. Now here I'm using Waterlock's Sealer Finish. And basically what it is, it's just their satin finish that has more solvent in it. Now, when I'm thinning Waterlocks, I use naphtha. They recommend mineral spirits. Mineral spirits will work fine. Just make sure you get paint grade mineral spirits. But I like naphtha because it's a fully volatile solvent. It doesn't leave any oils behind, and it flashes off fairly fast. And it kind of harkens back to, again, when I was a young guy in that lumberyard, one of the old timers, he must have been 40, that viewpoint we have when we're 16 years old. But he told me, when you're thinning oil-based products, whether it's paint or varnish, you use naphtha. When you're cleaning your brushes, you use mineral spirits and don't get them mixed up. So I've always kind of followed that. But naphtha really does a nice job. Now, what this is just basically thinned varnish for your seal coat. What that does is it helps the varnish penetrate into the surface of the wood better, saturate it better when it's a little thin. If it's too thick, it tends to stand up on the top and it doesn't get the penetration. What we want to do with the very first coat is we want to prime the surface. And what I'm talking about priming the surface is we want to get a uniform surface for our finish coats. Now, if we're working with egregiously soft woods, something like white pine that's very, very soft, you're going to want to saturate that soft wood with finish so that it will bring everything up to a common level. You're going to let it cure out for a day. And now when you start applying finishes on top, they'll all be at the same level. You're not going to be still filling that porous wood. Fred asks, do you use red sealer can first coat or just the green can of gloss and thin for the first coat? Either way, I tend to thin the gloss and make my own sealer. You can buy the ready-made sealer and use that as a wipe-on finish because it's thinned adequately that it does a great sealer. And also you need a thinned varnish for wiping on subsequent coats if you're going to wipe your finish on. So you can use this for your sealer. It works fine. Waterlocks sells this for a little less money than the regular labeled can simply because it has more thinner and less varnish in it, and they're very honest about that. So either way, I tend to use the green can for everything, and the green is the color of the gloss interior varnish. They also make a great line of spar varnish too. If you have exterior products, say a front door or something like that, their spar varnish is non plus ultra, I guess you'd say. It's very, very good stuff. So this is your basic starter kit. A cheap chip brush, your varnish, some nitrile gloves, and whenever I'm working with solvents these days, I usually have a vapor mask on. I've become much more aware of that as time goes on, so that I'm not breathing the fumes. And that goes for water-based stuff too. People think water-based stuff is benign. It's not. There are caustic fumes that emanate from that too. But that's a different story. I use all solvent-based. So I wear my mask, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour the varnish into a can or a jar that I'm going to work out of. One of the complaints that I've heard for decades is, varnish, you use it once and then it's all dried up in the can the next time you want to go use it. Well, that's because people open the can, they dip their brush in the can, they do, the whole job, they throw the cover back on the can, they set it on the shelf. Well, oxygen is what catalyzes this finish. That's the catalyst that makes it turn into a hard surface. And by dipping the brush in that can all the time, every time you dip the brush in, you're putting oxygen into that finish. Now, you use a third of a can of varnish on a job and you've been dipping your brush in it. Well, you could put that in a vacuum and it's still going to catalyze and turn into a solid. Might take a while, but it'll do it because you have thoroughly oxygenated or thoroughly catalyzed that varnish. So to make this stuff last, when you open the can, you pour it into another container, what you think you're going to use, and immediately cap that can back up, set it off to the side. You can do things like put Bloxygen in, which is just inert gas. If you have welding TIG, MIG equipment around, you can use a little bit of the argon gas and squirt in there, and that will keep it from going away. The old boys up in the lumberyard put marbles in their jars and in their cans, and just to displace the air, and that worked fine. When they couldn't get any more varnish out of it, they'd wash the marbles off, throw them in a jar, and use them for the next can. So there are various ways you can keep oxygen. You can buy the little plastic bags, dump the finish in there. But I find for the most part, just by being expeditious when I pour the varnish out, I pour it out quickly and I close it up. You notice that I pour from the side so it's not gurgling back and forth and pulling that oxygen in. I want a nice clean pour, close the jar up. At the end of the day, the stuff in that jar, I'm just going to leave it sit on the counter with the top open and evaporate and throw the whole thing away once it's dry. I am never going to put that varnish back into the can because, of course, I contaminate the whole can. So we pour it in a jar and then we just start slopping it on. This is the fun part. There's no real technique to it. You just get everything wet. and you want it thoroughly saturated, and you're going to keep it wet for probably about 20 minutes. Softwoods, maybe little bit more. You just, the areas that get dull, and you can see here we've got shiny areas and we've got dull areas. Keep moving the shiny stuff over to the dull areas and add varnish as you need it to get a uniform wet surface. What you're doing is filling in all the porous grain. And that grain will absorb only so much, and then it'll stop absorbing it. Those, like the swirl you see up at the top of that picture in there, that's going to absorb a lot of finish because it's end grain coming up to the surface. So you have to get that saturated. If you don't get it saturated, if I wipe this dry now, came back the next day and put another coat of finish on, it would still want to absorb into the soft areas and build on the harder areas. Well, now I've got this kind of mottled effect. You know, it's starting to get some build here, not much build over there. And that's what makes it really tough to get a nice uniform film on the surface of the board. So we're going to let it soak. When it stays uniformly shiny, and good lighting is so important for this. If you have really bad lighting in your shop, get a headlamp so you can see. Buy some of those utility lights and set down on the floor. Do whatever you can to get bright light. It's really, really important because you have to be able to get a raking light so you can see the finish that you're putting on. You can't finish blind. I mean, you can't do it. It's just impossible. You have to have good lighting for finishing. So I get that surface saturated, and then I wipe it completely dry. I don't scrub it, but I just wipe everything off the surface until it's dry because I have saturated that finish. And if you're good with it, you're not wiping a whole lot off. You're not wasting finish by doing this. Definitely not wasting finish. You're saving finish because down the line, it finishes a lot quicker. And this is basically what you see when you get to that point. It's not blotchy and shiny and dull. It's got a nice sheen on it, whether it's a dense wood like this maple, or if it's a ring porous wood like ash or oak, it's going to have a sheen on it because you have filled the grain of the wood. Now, it's important to let that cure. It'll dry fairly fast, and drying is just the solvent evaporating. Curing is allowing oxygen to get to it so it catalyzes the surface. If you don't give it sufficient cure time and you put a coat over the top of it, you're blocking those earlier coats from oxygen, and it will take a long time for them to cure. It degrades the finish. It can then result in a soft finish that's easy to dent. It's easy to scratch. So that first coat, it's really important to let it cure completely. I typically go 24 hours. I'll let it sit. I'll do the seal coat first thing in the morning, and then I set it off in the corner of my finishing room, and I don't touch it until the next day. I want to make sure that it is cured. It helps, fresh oxygen washing over it makes it cure faster. So if you have a room where the air is absolutely dead, like in my finishing room, I don't go in and out of there very often. It tends to form a barrier. You have this area over the surface where the oxygen has been pulled out of the air by the finish. It's catalyzing, and there's not much oxygen. It kind of gets to be oxygen starved. So if you can have just a little air movement, so it keeps washing that with fresh air that's got oxygen, fully oxygenated, you will speed up your drying time and your catalyzing time. And again, big difference between dry and catalyzed. You need to let that finish cure up. How do you know when it's adequately cured? Well, you're going to do a scuff sand between coats just to make sure you have a scratch pattern. Not absolutely necessary, but I always err in the side of caution. So, and that's the way you'll know if it's ready to go. If you take some 400 grit sandpaper and you lightly abrade the surface and the swarf that you create is white, you're ready to go. If the swarf is kind of translucent and kind of balls up, you have to let it cure. That finish is not ready to put another coat over the top. So make sure that your finish is adequately taken care of. And when you're done with this, wiping everything down, open up those rags, those towels, those cloths, open up those cloths and let them dry. Put them out someplace. Now, a lot of times what I do if I've got a big finishing project is I just grab up all the cloths, I go out behind my shop and I throw a match to them and burn them up, get them gone. That way you don't have to worry about them accidentally burning because you purposely burn them. When I had my wood stove, it was great heat. I'd just throw it in the stove and get a little heat out of the product too. So now we're going to get down to prepping the surface for your first coats of finish. Now I sand between my coats, typically 400 or 600 or maybe 800 grit, depending on how dense the wood is and how fine the finish is going to be at the end. But use a block over your sandpaper. You can make sanding blocks if you want. You can buy sanding blocks. I find this to be an expedient way to do it. Just tri-fold your piece of sandpaper. You take a half sheet, you fold it into three, and then you can use a well-worn sanding block on top of it. The reason I do this is because you're going to be a lot faster at sanding. Our hands are really bad at sanding because of all the little voids between our fingers and around our knuckles. We sand in grooves. Put a block on top of the sandpaper, man, it sands so much quicker. And if you're doing a grain-filled finish, it's really important to be sanding flat. So flat surface, block on top of the sandpaper. After the first couple of coats, you can use a lubricant if you want. It's not going to penetrate the finish anymore. First coats, be pretty careful because you might sand through into the bare wood, and having water on there would be a real no-no. But after you get subsequent coats, you can. When you're working on things like curved work or carvings or something like that, a 2-aught steel wool, good quality, Liberon steel wool, works really good for abrading and flattening out the finish. And people get so excited about dust. Oh my goodness, I got a little dust on my finish. The only coat that really counts is the very last coat. So don't worry about a little bit of dust in your finish. You're going to knock that down with sandpaper or steel wool anyway. And a lot of times, even on the very final coat, if I've got a couple little dust motes in it, I'm not going to worry because I'm going to go over it with 4-aught steel wool and burnish the surface anyway before I polish it back up to a gloss. And that gives you a very uniform surface. So now we've got it ready for the next coat. We can just wipe it on if we want. We can just saturate a cloth and wipe on a light coat. Again, out of a jar, not out of the can. Don't be dumping it from the can onto your rag. You're going to wreck the rest of the finish. This stuff is not inexpensive, so you don't want to waste it. It's very fairly priced, but it's you're going to pay a little bit. Now, people invariably ask me, how to use a tack cloth. Should I use a tack cloth? I'm going to back up just a little bit here. Gordon asked me a question. How do you flood the seal coat on vertical surfaces? Just keep moving it back up with the brush, Gordon. Just keep moving it back up with the brush. It'll soak into the wood, but the soft spots will soak in. They'll be dull. If you got real hard spots, of course, it'll start to run downhill, and just pick it up and move it back up over the soft spots. This is a low talent process. You're just slopping it on and moving it around. It's where lighting is really important, and you're going to spend 20 minutes moving it around, just slopping it on. Pretty soon, you're going to find you're not picking up as many runs, and you don't have as many dull areas, and you're getting there. And then all of a sudden, it's like, okay, everything's kind of uniformly shiny. Time to wipe it down and get going. Okay, back to tack cloths. If you're going to use a tack cloth, if you're determined to use a tack cloth, it's important to take the tack cloth out of the bag, open it fully, completely open. It's got this real sticky, waxy film on it. And then you're going to very lightly bunch it up with a nice big flat area on the bottom. You drop it on the board. And if you're not used to using a tack cloth, use one finger and move it around. Just enough pressure on it that you can move it over the surface. That's what you want. You don't want to push down on it because you can transfer wax onto the surface and it becomes a problem. You don't have to scrub it off. If that rag touches the dust, that dust adheres to the tack cloth or the tack rag. So just very lightly go over the surfaces, pick up any dust that you have on there, and you're good to go. Rotate the cloth around frequently. Shake it out. If you really have a lot of stuff, you probably should have vacuumed it off a little better. But shake it out, rotate it around. And when you get to the point where you can't feel anything sticky on your hands anymore, time to discard the tack cloth. If you use a tack cloth just for one little surface, don't throw the tack cloth away. Put it in a jar, seal the jar up, and the wax will last for a long time. I ran across some tack cloths here last spring when I was rearranging my shop and cleaning out my spray booth. I bet they'd been in that jar for 10 years and they were still fine. They just, once they're sealed up, they're fine. Okay, now we're going to talk about brushing the finish on. We have the seal coats on. We've scuff sanded it. We're ready to go. And again, just scuff sand it. All you need is sanding scratches. That's all you need. You don't need to sand it. You don't need to cut through the surface. All you need is just real quick sanding scratches. Where it's block's nice because you don't have any pressure points, or steel wool on round items. But now we're going to brush it. Brushes are important. These are the brushes that I have around, the Purdy brushes. They're okay. They're probably the best of the what I would consider to be the amateur brushes. You need to have an ox hair brush. Purdy makes a good ox hair brush. Good, not great, good. And you can get by with it, but it takes a higher level of skill to do a good finish with a lower level tool. And that's always been the way it is. If you want to work at your very best, buy the very best tools. If you buy second grade tools, you better have a high skill level if you want your results to turn out, because now you have to compensate for the tool. Same is true with finishing products. If you want to cheap out on your applicators, if you're spraying lacquer and you want to buy a really cheap spray gun, good luck. You got to have a really high skill level to make a cheap spray gun do what you want. So buy good quality equipment. It pays for itself over and over again. Even if you're not a professional, it pays for itself. In lack of frustration, things go better. So these are the brushes that I'm going to show you. The two on the left are Purdy. The two on the right, one is a Gramercy brush, the one with the brown on it, and the dark handled one is an Omega brush. Now, just notice I have paper wrapped around those brushes and taped. That's how that brush is going to be stored after you clean it. And we're going to talk a lot about cleaning a brush because, these brushes are not inexpensive. So you want to take really good care of them. When you're done cleaning them, you're going to roll them up in paper, fold that paper over the end, tape it up, let the brush dry out in there. The paper will help evacuate the water. When you pull that brush out, it'll look brand new. And these brushes last a long time. That brush on the right is my Omega. It's what's called a double round brush. And that brush is probably, I'm guessing 20 years old, and it's still in excellent shape. The brush on the left is the Gramercy brush, and we're going to talk a lot about that one because that is the bomb for putting on varnish. The two in the middle are Purdy brushes. And why is that Gramercy brush so good? Because it is a round end brush. That brush on the right hand side is a double round. It curves in both directions so that you can get into corners and little areas very easily and spread that varnish around. You don't want to dip your brush very far in the varnish. You don't have to load it up. You want a small amount of varnish in, and you want it to run off those bristles. It comes off the end of the bristles help smooth it out. That's the way it works. So what you want to see, well, here we'll just talk about this. This is the Purdy brush. They're cut off square. When you start applying the finish and you put the brush down on the surface, it doesn't spread out like this. If you've got that square edge, it tends to have a lot fewer bristles, and the bristles fold underneath a lot quicker. So they're dragging the finish across that the other bristles are it's running out of the brush. It just doesn't work. This way, you have a lot of bristle tips on the surface, and when you're applying that finish, it pulls out of the bristles very nicely, lays a nice uniform finish out, and you're off and running. Now, a lot of times you're going to have to thin your finish, and people ask, well, how much do I thin my finish? And I say exactly that much. And they always give me this look like, I can't tell you. It depends on the wood that you're using. It depends on the temperature. It depends on a whole lot of factors. So what you're going to do is you're going to put your finish in a container, and a piece of the project wood that is got seal coat on it. A piece of your project wood should follow you through all of your coloring and all of your finishing process, so you can experiment on that rather than on the piece you're doing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load the brush up, dip it in maybe about half an inch into the finish, and I'll show you a little trick for that in a minute. And then just run it across that board and see what it lays out. If it lays a nice uniform stripe for, maybe 6, 8 inches, 10 inches, something like that, you're good to go. If it runs away, well, then you put a little bit too much thinner in. You got to get a little more of the varnish in there. if it leaves spots and doesn't coat it nicely, that's when you have to start thinning it. And thin it lightly. It doesn't take much, just a little bit. That's why it's nice to have it in a separate jar. You're not thinning a whole can. Put a little bit of naphtha in there, stir it up, and again, dip it in and run it out. When you get a nice uniform draw, you're good to go. And having those tips like that are great because you don't want to push down on a brush like this. When you push down on it, you're squeezing the varnish up out of the top of that brush and it runs down and kind of gets, left behind, and you're wiping the front dry with those bristles. Plus, you're pushing all that varnish up into the brush where it's going to get up around the ferrule where it's really hard to clean it out. So by just, the tip of the brush going in the varnish, you've got a lot more control of your varnish. You have a lot more control of your process. Now, this is another thing that's the beauty about this brush. Very fine. It's like a cosmetic brush. It's just beautiful. When you have your varnish on the surface, and what you're going to do is you're going to thin your varnish if necessary, and you're going to just coat the whole surface. We're not worried about brush marks or anything now. We just quickly coat the surface, get a nice even amount of varnish on the whole surface. Make it as nice as you can, but work quickly. And there again, raking light so you can see what you're doing. And once you've got that surface coated, you're going to take that same brush without loading it. You're not going to add anything to it. Stand it directly on end, and with the pressure of the brush, maybe even a little less than the pressure of the brush, you'll find out as you start working it, you very uniformly drag that brush across the surface, just on the tips. It's a process called tipping off. This is what made finishers really pros years ago, is they could tip off a finish, and what it does is it breaks up the brush marks, makes them very uniform, and if it's properly thinned, those brush marks will disappear in 5 minutes. They'll be gone. You can do a brush finish that will rival any spray finish. A little story I like to tell is when I was a kid living up in northern Minnesota, a good friend of mine lived in a small community close by, and his neighbor had an old Plymouth that he drove as his work car. He worked in the mines, is up in iron mining country. And every spring he would sand that car down, and he'd knock all the old Bondo out of the rotten spots, and he'd put new Bondo in because over the winter with all the salt up there, it would eat away at it. And then he'd brush paint that car. And he was good with the brush. And it was this kind of light blue gray that he painted the car. And it looked brand new when he was done. He'd fill in all the rust, and boy, for the summer, it looked just great. And by the next year, it was time to do it. And he got a kick out of doing it. And he tipped off his finishes. He'd brush a panel, he'd tip it off, let it flow out. And it was amazing what you can do with a brush. Early automotive finishes were all put on with brushes. They didn't start spraying finish until probably into the teens, something like that. So you can make a beautiful finish, but again, tipping off. And the brush is critical. Again, this is a Gramercy brush, Gramercy ox hair. It's sold by a company called Tools for Working Wood. They're in Brooklyn, New York, and they have some really interesting tools. They have a lot of somewhat eccentric stuff there. It's a great sight to see. The guys who run the place are a lot of fun. Joel's a lot of fun, and go there and you'll find your Gramercy brush. If you can't remember Tools for Working Wood, just type in Gramercy ox hair brush and you'll find that site. Now, these are not cheap. I think the last time I looked, I think that brush is around $65, something like that. So, Fred says there's 64 brush. Yeah, Fred brings up a point here. Gramercy says their $64 brush is used for shellac and lacquer. Does not say varnish, assuming this is right brush, but you need to thin the varnish. Yeah, Fred, if you read down on that description a little ways, they have a quote from an article in Fine Woodworking where the person doing the quote, one of the finishing experts who writes for the magazine, says that this is the best varnish brush on the face of the earth. Basically, I'm paraphrasing. Why they don't call it a varnish brush, I think, is because of the I hate to use the term bastardization of the varnish name. Varnish used to be strictly oil-based product that was a polymerizing oil. And that was varnish. Well, now you get water-based varnish, you get polyurethane varnish, and those varnishes, no, you wouldn't want to use this with polyurethane. First of all, you need synthetic fibers for that junk. And secondly, it would just glop up. I mean, that's thick crap. I'm sorry. And the same thing with some of the other water-based stuff. It's just you're going to hurt the brush doing it. But for oil-based varnishes, for this finish, it is uh, the best brush you can get out there. It really works well. So $64 is their current price. Yeah, don't be afraid of it. Badger hair is a little bit, maybe a little bit nicer than this, but not much. And you'll pay double the price for a badger hair brush. And if you talk to high-end finishers who do brush finishing, of course, they always say that badger hair is the absolute best. Another thing you can do is you can go to an art supply store and buy their expensive brushes, like red sable brushes. They're small, but boy, are those handy if you're doing detail work. If you're getting into something that has lots of little crooks and crannies and stuff like that, one of those or a couple of those sable brushes are really nice. I've got a pile of sable brushes. I've got a pile of golden taklon brushes for shellac, all different widths, different shapes, and you'll use them. You'll find use for them. And if you keep your eyes open, a lot of times the art stores will have really good deals. Hobby Lobby last year was selling their golden taklon brushes for 50% off. Well, needless to say, I stocked up a little bit. So golden taklon is great for shellac, by the way. Very fine. It's a synthetic fiber, so it doesn't swell from the alcohol, and works really well. But get a good brush. It is really critical. Now, I was talking about dipping the brush into a container. Now, these are just examples of the container. That little tin pan is the one that I use all the time. If you can't find one of those little foil loaf pans will work fine. But put about 1/2 or 3/4 of an inch of varnish in the bottom of that. If you need to thin it, now's a good time. Put a little thinner in there, mix it up, and work out of that. When it gets down to the point you can't get any more out of there, pour a little in, and away you go again. And see, I've got a nice small diameter tin so that I'm putting varnish in there fairly often. It isn't exposed to air for a long time. The reason I do it is because when you're putting that finish on, you're busy looking across the finish, seeing what the gloss is like, and seeing if you got dry spots or spots that are too wet. You don't have time to always look over and watch how deep you're dipping your brush. So you tend to dip your brush until your fingers are in the varnish, and now you've got a big mess. With this, with only 3/4 of an inch of varnish in there, if I go all the way to the bottom, I haven't overloaded my brush. So that's usually what I do is I glance over peripheral vision. I see where the tin is. I dip the brush in, hits the bottom, I'm ready to go, and I can go right back to flooding it on. It makes life a lot easier, and it makes it easier to clean your brush. In between projects. Now, if I've got a really big project that's going to take pretty much the whole day to varnish, I'm going to have 2 brushes. Midday, I'm going to clean, or after a couple hours, I'm going to clean out that first brush because I don't want the finish catalyzing in that brush above the area that I'm working, because it's really tough to get it out of that brush once it's started to catalyze, because it really sticks to those bristles. So I'll stop, I'll clean the brush out, and then I'll take a fresh brush, I'll go back to work. And when that one gets loaded, I'll clean it out and I'll go back to the first one and work my way through there, because the water should be adequately out of it. But if I just have to stop for a little bit before the next process of my finishing, I've got a jar that has mineral spirits in it, and it's got a hole in the jar. And I drop the cover over my brush. I put the whole assembly down into the solvent, and then I pull the brush up so that just the area that I'm working is in the solvent, and I put a clothespin on, and it holds it in there. What it's doing is it's keeping air from getting to that varnish. So it isn't catalyzing as quickly. I mean, it already has oxygen in it, but it's not catalyzing as quickly. When I'm ready to use it again, I don't want to dip the whole brush necessarily in there. When I want to use it again, I pull it out, I shake the excess thinner and finish out. Now I go back and I dip it in my finish, and it's good to have a scrap board around that you can brush it out on to get all the thinner out. Go back, reload the brush, and get back to work. And that will cut down on how hard it is to clean that brush when you're done. So you got it all tipped off. The looks beautiful. It's flowing out really nice. Vertical surfaces are as easy to do as horizontal surfaces. You just need good light so that you can work that finish up and down a spindle or up and down a leg, tip it off, look for runs. You can pick up a run and move it back up until it starts to catalyze a little bit. Then you're stuck. If you get a drip in something, you got a drip right in the middle, have some blue masking tape handy. Pull off about a 3-inch section of blue masking tape, make a loop out of it with the sticky stuff on the outside. Now go over and very gently set that loop down on that drip or that run, and then pick it right back up. You're going to pull up the excess finish. Now you can go in with your brush, tip that area off, it'll blend in, and it's gone. So you can pick up runs that way. Just lay that tape into it. The loop allows you to pull it right back out. Take your brush, tip it off. If it gets to the point where it's starting to get a little sticky, leave it alone. You can always sand that run out before you put the next coat on, and you'll create more problems by trying to get it off when it's sticky, because now you've disrupted the surface and you end up with just a mess. So cleaning the brush. I've got this paint thinner there for cleaning the brush. Like the old timers told me, naphtha is for thinning the product. Mineral spirits is for cleaning the brush. But you want to use good quality mineral spirits. I use paint thinner grade mineral spirits. You don't want to use the eco stuff because it's got too much water emulsified into it. It doesn't do as good a job of cleaning. And when I clean the brush, I have 3 jars that the brush easily fits into the 3 jars, labeled 1, 2, 3 on the lid. The first jar is going to take the brunt of the varnish. I get it in there, I swish it around good, work it through with my fingers and squeeze the varnish back, or the thinner back into the jar, dip it in, squeeze it, do that 2-3 times. You don't have to throw that thinner away. You don't want to. Squeeze it back into the jar. You're going to use it more. So once you've got it completely squeezed out and you got that brush as clean as it's going to get out of that jar, take and snap that solvent and that varnish out of that jar. I do it on the tip of my boot. I just snap it so that that finish is flying underneath my boot. Be careful, it gets slippery. But I'll just snap it until it's as much as I can get out. Now I go to the second jar. And these are jars of clean paint thinner. Second jar, get in there, swish it around, squeeze it out, do the same thing. Get it as clean as you can, snap it out. Third jar, you're not going to remove much. You're going to dip it in there and it's just to make sure that you have all of the varnish out of that brush. Now, put the lid back on these jars and set them off to the side. You can, as that varnish catalyzes in those jars, it will precipitate out and end up in the bottom of the jar. You can decant the clean stuff off the top and reuse it. So if the number 1 jar is really getting full of solvent, I'll set it off to the side. I'll get a fresh number 3 jar, and I just move them all down, put the lids back on, 1, 2, 3, set that really clouded up one off to the side, let it decant. You can pour the mineral spirits off and you're good to go. And you can make paint thinner last a long time. There's no reason to be throwing it out. It's perfectly good. It just has particles in it that will settle out. They catalyze, they become a crystal or a particle and float down to the bottom, or sink to the bottom and float to the top. But do the 3 steps. Then you're going to take it under hot water. Make sure you get all the solvent out. You don't want to put solvent into your septic tank or into the water system. Take some dishwashing liquid, put a strand of dishwashing liquid on either side and work it into that brush and work up a really good lather. Then take hot water and wash it and then do it again. And that brush will be squeaky clean. It'll feel like nice clean hair. And when you're done with it, shake all the water that you can. And then, like I showed in that original photograph, lay it on a paper towel or a piece of brown paper bag, roll it up, fold the flap over the top of it, put some tape on and let it dry. Set it off to the side. When you pull that brush out the next time you're going to use it, it's going to look like brand new. It's going to be in great shape. And is there a good naphtha alternative for use in California? Yeah, where you can't get naphtha, you're going to have to use a really good grade of mineral spirits. If they don't allow naphtha for thinner, I don't imagine they probably sell Coleman lantern fuel either. Coleman lantern fuel has always just been naphtha. white gas, it's also referred to. So if you can't find it, then you just use paint thinner, but make sure it's paint thinner grade mineral spirits, not the eco mineral spirits, because it's way too many contaminants in it, and it'll leave crud behind that you don't want. So, but keeping that brush clean is really important. Okay, now we have our finish on. We're going to let each coat of finish cure. Um, I like to do a coat a day. I mean, that's fine. I'm not in that big a hurry to finish. If I'm really in a big hurry to get a finish done, I'll use shellac for all my build coats, and then I'll put a couple coats of varnish on top of it, and I'm off and running. If I'm really in a big hurry, I just spray it with lacquer. I have the spray gear, and I use lacquer a lot. Lacquer is an absolute, usable finish. It's repairable. You can make it look as nice as anything, but you need a spray booth, you need spray equipment, etc. So if you don't have a spray booth, if you don't have spray equipment, be patient, use a brush, do a beautiful job. And again, you don't have to worry about getting dust. I mean, you don't want to throw sawdust on the surface, but a little ambient dust in the air that falls on your project, don't worry about it. You're going to sand between coats anyway, and you can sand that dust out. So the only coat that counts is the last coat. That's why if you want a satin sheen or a matte sheen, that's the coat that you put, this very last coat, is you put satin or matte. That's really the only coat you'll ever see, is the very last one. Now I burnish my gloss. I use gloss all the time. I love gloss because of its clarity, and I love the way it looks, but I don't like the shiny, glossy look. I want a burnished, high luster look. So I rub it down with steel wool when I'm done. And I use Liberon steel wool. It's the best in the industry. It's soft. It's beautiful to work with. It wears like iron. How about that? No, it really wears well. And so it comes in a roll, and you roll out maybe a foot or so of it, and cut it off with your scissors, and you make your own pad. Just roll it up into a pad. When you use your steel wool, this is important. Notice the grains on the steel wool, the wires, are perpendicular to my fingers. Because if I have them parallel with my fingers, all I'm doing is running on top of those wires, and the wires are going the same direction my fingers are, and they just cut little channels in the wood, in the finish. They don't really do much. So you don't get a very concise finish. So I use them perpendicular to my hands so that they're scraping. The full length of the wire is scraping. And typically on a flat surface, I've got that foam block or a wood block on top of it, applying the pressure, light pressure. You don't have to get aggressive. Just be patient. At first, it looks like it's not doing anything because you're starting to abrade that real shiny surface, that hard surface. But all of a sudden, you'll notice as you're moving it back and forth that you're knocking down some of that gloss. You're mellowing it out a little bit. And that's what you want to do, is just go over it. If you're doing a satin finish, same thing, burnish it. It looks better after it's burnished. And so go over with that steel wool, burnish it good. And now you can go over it with cotton cloth if you want to bring the gloss back up, or you can wax it. And I like waxing a surface. Here I'm just burnishing with a cloth, get a nice surface, but I like waxing. Here I'm using butcher's wax. I don't use that very often anymore. I still have some around here. I discovered Liberon finish a few years ago, and that's what I use almost exclusively, is Liberon finish. Liberon finish has a lot of carnauba wax in it. So I used butcher's wax. It was bowling alley wax, had a lot of carnauba wax in it years ago. And it was, tough. It really holds up. Carnauba wax is the best. It really is. It's tough to apply, but I've got a trick for it. And because when it dries out, it's very hard to buff out. So whether you're working with Liberon or butcher's wax or any of the waxes, this is the way to apply. Take a square piece of cotton cloth, well-worn t-shirt. This is a Star Wiper cloth. Star Wiper, check their website out sometime. Star Wiper makes rags. That's what they do. They refurbished a mill, I think in South Carolina, that knits cloth, and they knit new rags. And they are the most absorbent, nicest rags. They have this poly cotton blend that it's amazing how it absorbs, and is beautiful for finishing, just beautiful. So take a square of cloth. I'm going to take a big glob of wax and put right in the middle of that cloth. Nice big glob. Be generous with it, because when you're done with your waxing, you're going to open that rag up, let it cool down, because your hands will heat that wax up. Let it cool down, and you can literally lift that wax, put it right back in the can, because you haven't contaminated it. It's perfectly good wax. Because what you're going to do is you're going to wrap that rag up around that wax. You're basically making a French polishing cloth out of it. Wrap it up, twist the top, and form a nice little bubble on the bottom. Pat it on the palm of your hand to start driving that wax through. And then you just simply wipe on a coat of that wax. You'll see that nice film move on to your project, and you're giving it a nice coat of wax. There's no streaks, there's no ridges, there's nothing. It will haze over in probably about 5-10 minutes. It'll haze over. Give it a half an hour. Buff it down with a cotton cloth just to knock all the haze off. Go back and give it another coat. I typically like to give it 3 coats, and I typically wait about an hour in between. I want to make sure that that first layer, all the solvent's burned out of it, and it's thoroughly dry. That way I'm building one layer on top of the other, not emulsifying the first layer, and the finish it gives you is incredible. I mean, it's just super slick and smooth. Throw a little water on it, the water just beads up and disappears. You got to be careful putting a wet glass on. That's why you need a coaster on a table. Put a wet glass on, it just migrates away. Wherever the low side is, it just is gone. Beautiful finish, absolutely beautiful finish. And the wax acts as a protectant for your surface. It repels the water, it repels abrasion. When the wax starts to degrade and you notice that water doesn't beat up on it anymore, clean the old wax off. And it's easy to do. There again, a little bit of naphtha or mineral spirits will clean off that old wax. Soap and water first to get anything organic off, and then get it down to the bare surface. And typically the only place you're going to do it is on top surfaces where it sees a lot of abrasion. It's not like you got to, if you do a chair, you don't have to re-wax the rest of the chair. You're just going to re-wax the arms and the headrest and the seat, and that's it. And away you go. Dean asks, would a Carnauba automotive wax be a good furniture wax? Not necessarily. A lot of the Carnauba based waxes also have a little silicone in them. You really have to be careful with that. Zymol wax is a wax that I use on my cars, and it's a high-end wax. It works beautifully. Matter of fact, that's how I learned how to do this waxing, was from car restoration people. But I wouldn't use it on wood. There's no real gain that you have from it. The Black Bison is mostly Carnauba wax with a little bit of modern wax in it. What do they call it? There's microcrystalline wax in it. There's Renaissance wax. It's Restorer's wax that's, I think it's 100% microcrystalline wax. It makes a surface slick and shiny immediately. It won't bother your finishes. Problem is, it's not real durable. It's all hat and no cattle, as to say an old phrase. But it looks good and it feels nice. But Black Bison, just think of buffalo wax, works really well. And just make sure there's no silicone, or you're going to run into real problems if you try to refinish. But you buff this stuff down and you end up with just this beautiful, that's what I like to see for a finish. It's gloss, but it's not shiny, plasticky looking gloss. It is high luster, and it's just beautiful. There's just nothing better than a nicely polished varnish surface. I'll put it up against any finish. I mean, I like shellac, I like lacquer, but they can't equal what varnish can do. And again, if you want to use shellac for the majority of your piece, it's a great finish. It's very durable. It's always available in gloss. That's the only surface it comes in. There are ways you can deaden it down, but you can just polish it off a little bit if you don't want the high gloss. And then just coat your wear surfaces with varnish. It expedites the system. It saves your varnish, although shellac has gotten to be fairly expensive too. But it can make it quick if you're in a hurry. And it makes it easy to repair and refinish, and you get that gorgeous luster. I mean, that's just beautiful. There are few finishes that are nicer than that. And it's fun to do. My wife loves my finishes. I'll call her out to the shop when I've got a piece done, and she'll come out and first thing she does, she walks over and grabs it and starts rubbing her hands over it. And she goes, "Oh, that's beautiful." And I said, "Yeah, how about the piece?" "Oh, yeah, that's pretty nice, but it's the finishes." She just loves those finishes. And we're tactile creatures. I mean, that's why you go to a furniture show and there are signs all over that says, "Please do not touch." You go to a car show, "Please do not touch," because we look at it and it looks nice. And for some reason, we want to go up and see if it feels as nice as it looks. And these finishes, yes, they absolutely will. So, in a not too brief nutshell, there's finishing with varnish. And it's important. Get a really good quality finish and get a really good quality brush, and you'll have no problems. Dennis has a note here, says wax or de-wax shellac. Always de-wax shellac. Always de-wax shellac. You pay a little bit more for it, but wax can pose adhesion problems. Finishes don't like to stick to wax, so make sure it's de-waxed. John has a question. What was the source mentioned for good wax application fabric? It's called Star Wipers. I believe they're in Ohio, and they have great product. The product I buy is the cotton poly blend. They also recycle rags, recycle cloth into rags, but I buy their new freshly knit cloths, and they work great. They gave me a packet of them at one of the woodworking shows several years ago, and I did a little sample pack, and I brought it home, and I thought, well, how do you test how absorbent a cloth is? You clean your glasses if you're a glasses wearer, because that will show you real quick. So I washed my glasses real good. I took the cloth and I wiped it, and it didn't feel like it was picking up any water at all. It just slipped over the glass, and I thought, oh, these things aren't very good. And then I looked, and no, it had gotten all of the water immediately. And I was just wiping on nice, clean, dry glass. And whoa, that kind of sold me. And I started using them in the shop, and my goodness, they work really well. They aren't cheap. I think a 4-pound or 5-pound bag of them is about $30. But believe me, a 5-pound bag will last you for years. There's a lot of rags stuffed in that bag.